So with the whole brewing process, you're going to actually see part of the process. Today we're brewing up our black lager, which is going to be our roost lager, just with some midnight wheat. We're trying to refine our process of lagering just to help streamline it, make it a little easier to plan out brews instead of trying to be like, okay, it should take 6 weeks. Try to, for certain, know whether it's 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, or however long it's going to take. And so before I hop into, showing you guys some of the process, I'm going to explain a little bit about the products that we use to make the beer. So we use the couple main ingredients of beer is water, malted barley, and hops, as well as yeast. So we use the malted barley we get from Great Western Malting Company. They grow all their barley here in southern Idaho. And then send it up to Vancouver, Washington to malt it. It's where they start to germinate it and then kind of dry it out as it's starting to germinate. That allows you to harvest the sugars from the two-row malted barley that the yeast will use to make alcohol. We get most of our hops from Mill 95 out in Parma. They are a hop pelletization plant. They have hop fields ranging from down here near Wilder and that up to the Yakima Valley in Washington. And so most of what comes in here is local. It may have made a stop somewhere else before coming back, but we try to focus as much local as we can. A great example of that is when every year during October or so we do what's called a fresh hop beer, where we go out to a local hop farmer, get the whole hop leaves right off the vine, and come back and brew it in a beer within 24 hours. So it adds a whole nother dynamic to brewing beer and really just showcases local hops. So with that, we'll then start moving into the brew process. Okay, so we're back in the brew process right now. You can actually see our head brewer working. He is transferring over from the mash tun into the boil kettle and sparging. Most of those terms probably don't mean much to most people, but I'll kind of explain what's going on a little bit more in depth. So right here we have our mash tun. Its whole purpose is to hold grain in about 150 degree water in it. With that, it'll actually activate the enzymes in the grain to start breaking down starches into simple sugars that the yeast can eat. We will then rinse it with about 170 degree water, flush it down and into the boil kettle to boil. Where we're boiling, that'll help caramelize some of the flavors and then also activate the hops that we add in. The longer that you boil a hop, the more bitterness that you get. The shorter, the more flavor and aroma. It'll also kill any bacteria that were on the grain to make this beer sanitary. Once it's finished up in there, it'll be transferred over to one of our fermentation vessels. The current brew that he's doing today will go in this 15-barrel fermenter. Once it's in here, we'll pitch the yeast. We are using the lager yeast, so it'll ferment a little bit colder than a typical ale yeast. With this, the yeast will eat the sugars and produce CO2 and alcohol. So we have buckets full of sanitized water underneath with a tube running down, so that way nothing can get in, but the CO2 can still escape without creating a giant bomb. With this here, it's got a coned bottom, so that as the yeast start to die off, it can fall down and the beer stays up above it. We will then dump the dead yeast off and then start to do what's called a cold crashing, where we drop it down to about 34, 36 degrees to let any particles in solution start to fall out of solution so the beer becomes clear. Once we've cold crashed in there, we will transfer it over to our bright tank, which is right here. The whole purpose of this tank is just to keep the beer cold, carbonated, and clear. So it'll stay at that 34 to 36 mark. We'll start pumping in CO2 through a stone that we have in there that's full of micropores. Once the CO2 goes through the stone, it'll break up into smaller bubbles through the micropores and absorb into solution. Once we have it carbonated, we keg, can, bottle, all along. We do everything right here in-house to feed their cows. So got some giant rakes in there that'll definitely nice. I think. Yeah, you were never here when we had the old dairy tank and you used to have to use a bucket. Okay, so after the brew process is completed, everything's been fermented, there's a couple of different options. You can keg it, bottle it, can it, or put it into a barrel to continue aging and add another layer of complexity. Right behind me I have a bourbon, 7-year-old corn whiskey, a rum barrel, a wheat whiskey barrel, a rye whiskey barrel. All of those are going to add different flavors and impart a different flavor than with each barrel. So it's a fun way to kind of show off some barrel aging. Most people, when they think of barrel aged beer, think bourbon, which will give off the vanilla, a little oaky notes. All of these will bump alcohol from the barrel leaching the alcohol in and out. Typically it bumps it up about 2% or so. So with this, we're going to try to stage these releases out over the next couple months throughout the year, just to showcase that, okay, if you put it in a rye barrel, it'll give off these notes, where a rum barrel will give off these notes.